Helen Carr joins me again today to discuss the rest of her most recent book, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. Today, we discuss the reigns of King Edward III and Richard II, from Edward's early reign in which he was bullied by his mother's domineering lover, Roger Mortimer, to his becoming viewed as perhaps the greatest of the Plantagenet kings, through to his feckless grandson, Richard II, who all but destroyed trust in the monarch to such a degree that he was forced from the throne, acting as a precursor to the momentous drama that would engulf England in the next century, a period known to us all as the Wars of the Roses. To the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 96, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century, part 2, with Helen Carr. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Helen Carr. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks so much for having me again.
Very welcome. So we're here for part 2 of our discussion all about your book, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. And in part 1, we discussed the reign of King Edward II. And so today we're jumping into the world of his son and his great-grandson, Richard II. So to start, despite his father still being alive, so King Edward II, King Edward III, aged 14, is crowned King of England. At that point, how much personal rule did he actually have, though?
Very, very little. So he was crowned after his father had voluntarily / involuntarily abdicated from the throne, and his son took over. But from this point, and just before this as well, Isabella, his mother, and her lover Roger Mortimer had far more power than the young king did himself, even though he was of an age that he would have been expected to be able to rule. Isabella acted as a sort of regent, and with Mortimer at her side, they wrapped the young king in cotton wool. They didn't really allow him to have very much of his own agency. They controlled the people who were allowed to spend time around him. And I think he felt incredibly trapped. It was quite a claustrophobic environment for this young king to be in, and he wasn't really able to gain any sort of rhythm or stride with his new rule.
Yeah, because wasn't there a famous quote about him being referred to as a lamb surrounded by wolves? I seem to recall there's something.
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate, because I think that he was, Isabella was incredibly clever. I think she had the ability to be very manipulative, and Roger Mortimer was a very overbearing, confident man. And Isabella and Mortimer were in a phase of their life and reign where they had developed a huge amount of power and control, and they enjoyed that so much. They were relishing in it. They were so afraid of it being dismantled as Edward III was able to sort of grow into his kingship, that they sort of destabilized him, and they kept him smaller so they could be larger. And that was how they were able to try and control him for as long as they did.
So at what point do we really start to see a breakdown in the relationship between Edward and his mother and Roger Mortimer? What was causing it? Was it just a desire to come into his own, effectively?
So I think, the famous moment is at Nottingham Castle, where you see Edward III and his band of young men storm Nottingham Castle and drag Mortimer out, arresting him. But I think this started with the execution of Edward's uncle. So Isabella and Roger Mortimer had Edmund, Earl of Kent, so it's the future Joan of Kent's father. They had him executed, and this is the younger half-brother of Edward II. This is a royal prince. This is the son of Edward I, that they think they have so much authority and control that they feel powerful enough to order his execution. And the reason that he was executed is they were trying to seek out traitors who were against their regime, as or really as they pinned it, against Edward III, but it was really against Mortimer and Isabella. And the way they did was they lured Edmund into a trap, making him believe that Edward II was still alive, and prompting him to write to his brother, who he thought was his brother. And that letter that he wrote to his brother was pressed really likely into the palms of Roger Mortimer, not the king who had for some reason not been killed. That's a myth. He definitely had been killed. But they managed to convince people that Edmund was a traitor. He was trying to restore the former Edward II onto the throne, and that's how they were able to arrest him and have him executed. But this was such a brutal act. They couldn't find anybody to execute this prince, and he had to wait for his execution. And eventually, a prisoner who was dragged up from the gutters was brought out and promised his freedom in exchange for beheading Edmund, Earl of Kent. And it was such an extraordinary, brutal act. It was incredibly Machiavellian and unchivalrous. It moved against every aspect of royal authority and every sense of duty, really, social duty. That I think that this was the moment that really pushed Edward over the edge, to have his young
Yeah.
uncle executed like that under the orders of Roger Mortimer, who comparatively was a nobody. And
Yeah.
and I think that it was that pushed Edward to say, right, enough is enough. And then he started to set the cogs in motion to overthrow Mortimer and his mother and take up his kingship with real rigor.
Do you think there was ever a moment when Mortimer sort of saw the irony that he was almost starting to behave like the Despensers in some respects?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think this comes down to humanity. And I think it doesn't come down to the individual. I think it comes down to the situation and the way
Yeah,
that
definitely.
constructs are formed. And I think that he found security in power in the same way as the Despensers found security in power, and that connection to the highest echelons of the realm, kingship, and the closeness to kingship. And when one had that, they didn't want to relinquish it, and the fear of relinquishing it. It's like when you're at the top. I use the motif, the Wheel of Fortune, to describe this. When you're at the top of the wheel, you have to work as hard as you can to stay at the top. But
Yeah.
when you are up there, anybody is going to spin the wheel. They're going to try and tip you off it. And when you are tipped off, you're not going to get back up again. So I think Mortimer spent so much of his time just trying to retain everything that he had worked for. And he knew that as soon as the young Edward was able to be powerful and have his own say in how he wished to rule, well, Mortimer wouldn't necessarily come out of that favourably. So I think that he'd sort of he'd found himself in a bit of a corner, and it's a little bit like, the rather sort of horrible image of you don't corner a rat because then they start to attack back. That sort of feels a little bit like Roger Mortimer.
So, can you just briefly talk to me about what that moment looked like when Edward he throws off the shackles and him and his friends effectively storm in on Edward's mother and Mortimer?
Yeah, it's an amazingly cinematic moment, and
Mm.
it was a wonderful, fun moment to write. I mean, it's like sort of almost writing fiction, really. It's very atmospheric.
Very Game of Thrones, isn't
So
it?
it was very Game of Thrones. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the 14th century was very Game of Thrones. So yeah, there's this moment where Edward has obviously been planning this coup, and he's got some of his favourite men around him, including Henry, future Earl of Lancaster. Who's his Henry of Grosmont, his dear friend. He has his group of, he's got Sir William Montacute. He's got this group of nobles who he's grown up with. They're his brothers in arms, and they meet at the bottom of Nottingham Castle. And Nottingham Castle's on quite a steep rock. It's on like a steep, like craggy hill, and there were these tunnels and routes into Nottingham Castle from through this rock. And they were able to go up inside the castle with Edward letting them. So they went through the tunnels, and then Edward was inside the castle already, and he was able to let them in. And I think Mortimer knew something was being planned, because he had tried to like squeeze information out of Edward and his closest friends earlier on in during the Nottingham Parliament, and none of they'd all been like, no, nothing's going on. We've got nothing to talk say. Everything's
Yeah.
fine. And Mortimer and Isabella were having a council meeting with they were with a couple of other members of the sort of smaller council, and Edward and his men, armed, burst into the room, and there was a scuffle. And they arrested Mortimer and dragged him out. And famously, to the screams of Isabella, so, gentle Mortimer, fair son, don't hurt my gentle Mortimer, or something badly paraphrased along those lines. It's unlikely she said that, but I can imagine that her reaction was quite a big
Mm.
one. And he dragged Mortimer away. He wanted to execute him there and then, but he was persuaded to give him a trial. And Mortimer was given the same level of trial as his uncle had been
Right.
given. And it's pretty much named in his trial the reason for Edward executing him, and that is the murder of his uncle. So I think that that was what Edward really was completely maddened by. And I think he also suspected that it was Mortimer that had his father killed. So he was desperate to get rid of him. And Mortimer was given sort of an ignominious death. He wasn't beheaded like a other member of nobility might be, like Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, but he was hung naked as a thief. So it's like he'd
Symbolism
tried
there.
this, the symbolism that he had
Yeah.
tried to steal something that wasn't his, which is the authority of the crown.
So, in the wake of Mortimer's execution, Edward is now fully in his majority, effectively ruling as king in his own right. He is married to Philippa of Hainault. So, can you just introduce me to her? Who was she? What was her story?
Yeah, so Edward was married. It was an alliance that would have been arranged by Isabella, in order to create an ally for herself against the Despensers and her former husband. And he was William Count of Hainault, and Philippa was his daughter. And what he had was a lot of men and wealth that he was able to give to Isabella for her campaign. So that was the agreement, that Philippa was going to be the next Queen of England in exchange for a lot of soldiers from Hainault and an aid in attacking the Despensers and overthrowing Hugh Despenser. But it turned out to be a brilliant marriage. It seems to have been a love match. Philippa was a brilliant queen. Everybody loved her. She was considered to be, play the queenly part with aplomb. And I do
Mm,
wonder, to an extent, as to how much her image was sort of buffered up as this very sort of Marian style queen in comparison to Isabella, who was also nicknamed the She-Wolf of France. And it's
yeah.
quite a sort of misogynistic idea of queenship and womanhood, that Isabella was in some way lesser because she fought back against the system. Whereas actually
Yeah.
they played very similar roles in most of the part of their queenship. But what Philippa did, which her later biographers loved, particularly the Victorians, that she had lots of babies and she was a successful
Yes.
mother. She also invested heavily into the economy of England. So she was very interested in the wool trade. She was interested in the development of the cloth industry. So she was generous with that. There are some famous scenes of her interceding, which was a big part of queenship in the Middle Ages, was intercession and stepping in on behalf of supplicant to her husband, saying, please listen, I'm interceding on behalf of this person, can you help so and so, or can you look more kindly on so and so? And she did that a lot too, and she invested in academia and universities. So she is considered to be a great queen, and I think that she was a very steady influence on Edward III, who was notoriously quite hot-headed.
Yes, and you mentioned there about the fact that they were very successful in the production of many children. They have eight sons and five daughters. I mean, eight sons that a certain
Yeah,
six
I know.
times married king would have been beside himself to achieve those sorts of numbers. But what we sometimes see in history is that an excess of heirs can be problematic. We only have to look at Henry II, I think, as an example of that.
Yeah,
But am I
yeah,
right in thinking that the royal family under Edward III behaved in a way that was much more akin to maybe the modern royal family of the firm, that they had this extended network of, for want of a better term, sort of working royals coming together, and that this
yeah.
this was different for the medieval period, right?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think that's exactly what Edward III tried to create. I mean, he didn't have a particularly close bond to his siblings. And he married off his sister to the King of Scotland. And I think that with all of his sons, he wanted to establish a very European type kingship. I think he used his sons to distribute his power across Europe. So he wanted, eventually he put the Black Prince in Aquitaine. He wanted Lionel, his son, his second marriage was to the Viscount to the Countess in Italy. So he planted Lionel over in Italy. Originally, John of Gaunt was considered to have been named as an heir to the Scottish throne, but when that didn't manifest, he was very supportive of Gaunt's his hopeful kingship of Castile. I think he wanted his sons to be placed in important positions throughout Europe. He was trying to create, I think, a sense of a Plantagenet empire in the way that Henry II had forged, but I think he wanted to do it more successfully by using his sons. And I think that he trusted his sons. I think he relied on his sons heavily. I think he gave them positions of power without being too controlling, which is the difference with Henry
Mm,
II. I think that he
yeah.
didn't allow his sons to exercise their own sense of rule, and he was very happy for them to do that. And I think they were a cohesive unit. I think they all got on very well. I think they had a huge amount of respect for their father and their mother. And I think that they were a very strong Plantagenet
Yeah,
family.
this was a family that it appears that there was harmony between all of these children.
Yeah, I think they got
Yeah.
on. I mean, Edward used to get his children around him around Christmas time, and they all seemed to have a good time together. They were very loving. I mean, when Gaunt lost his sister Joan and Edward and Philippa lost their daughter Joan, later on, even when Gaunt was in adulthood, he endowed an obit for her at Bordeaux Cathedral, which goes to show that she was still very much in his heart and mind. These they were a close family, and the people who were around them, cousins, they were also considered as close as well. When Henry, Duke of Lancaster, died of plague in 1361, his funeral was taken very seriously by Edward III, and he was treated with a huge amount of reverence and respect. And I think that he was deeply saddened by his loss.
Mm. So, one of the most famous aspects of Edward's reign was the establishment of the Order of the Garter, which is still, I mean, it's the oldest
Mm.
order of chivalry in the world that's still running today. So, what was it, and why did Edward create it? What was he looking to achieve?
Yeah, so the Order of the Garter was sort of part of this trend for demonstrating chivalric ethos during the Hundred Years' War. So Edward had just won the most successful battle of the first part of the Hundred Years' War with the Battle of
Mm,
Crécy. He had taken Calais. He had gone this protracted siege of Calais, which had lasted for over a year, and then he had managed to take the most important port on the coast of France. And he was at his absolute pinnacle of kingship and conquest, and he wanted to mark all of that through this sort of chivalric device, a way of demonstrating his his sort of the moral code of conduct that was chivalry, but also the unity of him and his men, because it was really his ability to form this cohesive unit of friends and men working together that enabled him to be so successful as a military king. And the Order of the Garter was effectively this. It was an elitist fraternity that did allow some women. His daughter Isabella was established in the Order of the Garter later on. And I think that it was something that it was a way of commemorating his success, but also his family, his friends, the people that he felt were important to his victory, to his kingship, and to his sense of to the realm. I also think that it was something that was a long time in the making, because if you look at Edward's reign much earlier on, he created something called the Order of the Round Table. And the Order of the Round Table kind of became the Order of the Garter. So that was based on Arthurian influence and mythology, and Edward was trying to create this sense of an Arthurian court with him at the
Mm.
head. And he was playing into this round table. And the round table wasn't necessarily a physical thing, it was more of a concept. So round tables would be it was actually a tournament. So round tables were a tournament that would be fought between two opposing sides. So that was what the round table was. So it was kind of a joyful thing that, but it was also had a
Mm.
military backdrop to it. So the Order of the Round Table kind of became the Order of the Garter, and the Order of the Garter was something then that was established to be celebrated every year. So on the 23rd of April, every single year, the idea was that they would celebrate, they would wear Garter robes, and they would have a big feast day. And it was a way of celebrating their successes. And it's quite funny because the French tried to copy this. And so they developed something called the Order of the Star. And they were like, we're going to do it, the Order of the Garter, but it's going to be bigger and it's going to be better. And they established it where they had far more knights who were members of the Order of the Star. But one of the major principles of the Order of the Star was that if whoever was in battle, no member of the Order of the Star on the battlefield was allowed to leave the battlefield until the battle was done. And that became a real problem because at the Battle of
Yeah.
Poitiers in 1356, that was how John II was captured by the Black Prince because he was so bound by his chivalric order, the Order of the Star. It sort of shot him in the foot.
I see. Okay, that's fascinating.
I know. They didn't think that one
I
through.
really didn't. Not at all logical. So Edward ended up having a 50-year reign. It's one of the longest in
Yeah.
English history. Certainly by that stage in history would have been the
Yeah.
longest. He dies in 1377. Did his contemporaries view his reign as a major success?
Yes, I think they did. I think that he was at his heyday during the Hundred Years' War. I think that that was when he was at his most popular and his most successful, when he was doing well at war, when he was generating income from war, and when he was gaining land in France, which was sealed by the Treaty of Bretigny. But I think after that, after the Treaty of Bretigny, when war with France was sort of at moments kind of rumbling on, he became a king who was less popular, and it's almost like Edward's greatest tragedy was aging. There's this
Yeah, reigning for
wonderful,
too long.
yeah, there's this wonderful kind of vignette of Edward towards the end of his reign, where he's actually at the Garter feast and he's no longer Philippa of Hainault has died, so he's the only woman in his life is his mistress Alice Perez, and he sort of comes across as this slightly sort of lecherous old man, and he's looking frail on his throne, and he's perhaps by now suffered at least one stroke, mild stroke. So he's not able to be as independent, as coherent, as authoritative as he was in his youth. And it is this sort of the tragedy of age is that, he almost didn't do the Henry V thing where he didn't die
Mhm.
on the battlefield or he didn't die when he was at his sort of epoch. And so
Yeah.
you have a king that was quite sort of degenerated by the end of his reign and eventually did die of a stroke later on. But I think that he has become often eulogized for being the greatest king for his military successes and also I think for the length of his reign. Often we see
Yeah.
a case that if a king reigns for a very long time, they're almost considered to be great because of the fact they reigned for a long time. And yes, I think
Yeah.
Edward III did deserve some of those accolades in the sense that he was a very effective military leader. He was a very popular king earlier in his reign, but I think there's a lot of things that Edward did that people overlook and consider him as great, and I don't think he's as great. I think that in many ways, I think he was greedy and I think he was proud. And I think that his acts, the way he acted in France was appalling. And I don't believe that he should be put on as high a pedestal as he has been by previous biographers,
I see.
because
Okay.
I think that often, historians, and this goes back to antiquarian historians, we really celebrate military success and victory, but we don't actually scratch away at that and go, okay, but what does that mean? What did that mean for the realm? What did that mean for the layman? Yes, he created England as this sort of sense of he fostered a sense of nationhood within England. He convinced people to fight for England, to feel that they belonged to something, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
But I think that the way that he behaved in France, the use of the chevauchée, which was a very aggressive model of warfare, and the way that his wars impacted the common person, I think was appalling. And I think that if he were to be judged today, it would be the sort of action that would be considered a war crime.
Do you think a large part of it actually just come down to the fact, though, that he is sandwiched between two kings who are viewed as disasters?
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it. And I think that
Yeah.
he was very good at learning from the mistakes of his father. And I think he was far more like his mother than he was his father. And I think that he was a very effective king comparatively. And what he did do very well, which every good king needed to do, was unite the nobility and make them feel part of something.
Hmm.
So yeah, this is the thing. I think we're always very tempted, I think, as historians or just as people, to create former kings or former major figures in history as these sort of caricatures. So we're tempted to create the sort of hunchback Richard III,
Yeah.
who's a child killer, or we're
Yeah. Bloody
tempted
Mary.
or
Yeah.
we're tempted to create a Bloody Mary or Gloriana
Yeah.
Elizabeth. And actually, these were just people. And one of the major themes in my book is humanity. And when I think about humanity, I think about the nuances of the individual and how we all have our foibles, and how we all have things that we are great at, and then we all have our flaws. And I think that
Yeah.
the same applies to these monarchs that we consider with such binary terms in the past.
Yeah.
So I think when I'm thinking about Edward III, I can go, well, objectively, I think he was great at this. And he was great at that. He was really fun. He was funny. Like, people wanted to be around him. He was like a magnet. He had the charisma that you want to see in a king. He had the clarity of thought. In the Black Death, he knew that he had to close all the parliaments. He knew he acted well, and he acted accordingly. But when it came to some of his actions elsewhere and his ability to spend money, get the realm into debt, to ravage the land in France with no real benefit, I think that in some ways he could be considered on much kind of lesser terms than he has
Mm.
been. And I have a real problem with the way that often these warrior kings are so revered,
Yeah.
when it was at the cost of human life. And I think that
Yeah.
it's not about applying our own judgment or our own times to people in the past, but it is a sense of right and wrong. And I do think that we need to turn the way we consider these events on its head a bit, because I think one of the major problems is that we do allow these sorts of behaviors to seem to be something that we applaud, rather than something we go, well, that's not right. And you know,
Yeah.
it people it's tantalizing, isn't it, to think about a king and going to war and fighting in battles, but who are the victims of war? We know who they are. They're the common person.
There's also a certain irony, I suppose, in the fact that with his death, despite having 8 sons, having had 8 sons, that his throne passes to a grandson. So the son of his eldest son who predeceases him, that's how we end up with King Richard II, who ascends the throne at the age of just 10. Were there worrying signs from the outset that Richard is going to be very far removed from the type of king that his grandfather had been?
Yeah. Um, Yeah, but I think were the worrying signs from the outset worrying signs from Richard as a character, or were they worrying signs from the way that Richard was treated?
Mm,
And I think you have to think of this sort of, it's a little bit like Frankenstein, and who is making the monster? Was it all, is it a chicken and egg situation?
yeah.
Like, was Richard created or was Richard who he was? And I think that with Richard, I think it's a combination of the two. I think he had natural characteristics, but I think that his sense of identity and his sense of and his ego, his sense of divinity, his sense of kingship, I think was enhanced, if not fostered, by those around him from a very young age. Richard was the second son. He was the second son of the Black Prince. He was never meant to be king.
Yeah.
That was supposed to go to his older brother. Well, it was supposed to go to his father and then his older brother. So Richard was never in line for the throne. It was just by unhappy coincidence that that was the case. The Black Prince died of what was probably a prolonged gastrointestinal illness, possibly something like bowel cancer. He died in his 40s, not super young, but comparatively young to his father.
Mm.
And then his brother Edward died as a young child, in not in infancy, but he was still only a little boy, and so that left Richard as the only surviving heir of this line of Plantagenets, and his mother Joan of Kent kept him very well cared for. And, I mentioned the term wrapped in cotton wool in relation to Edward III, but Richard he was completely cosseted.
Mm.
He was treated like this precious jewel of an individual. And it was just out of fear of not having anyone else. And, when Edward III died and Richard was going to be the next king, one of the first actions were all the ports were closed instantly. England became so vulnerable in that one moment because an England ruled by a child was an incredibly vulnerable position against the French. And,
Yeah.
England had been antagonizing the French for the last, goodness, like 30 years. And then the French are like, well, there's a little kid on the throne now, maybe it's our turn. And they did have a good go.
Mm.
Um, and Richard was the way of protecting Richard's kingship. I always think that his coronation is an interesting example of how Richard was created. So if you look at the descriptions of his coronation, everything is white. It's ethereal, it's godly, it's divine. It's as if he is an angel that has been placed on earth, and he's treated like this sort of holy person.
Mm.
It's almost saintly. And that was all political propaganda in relation to Richard. It's instead of having this fantastical military king, you've got this king who is incredibly divine,
Yeah.
and he's this divine king who we all have to revere and applaud. And I think a lot of that went to Richard's head, and I think that it was enhanced as he got older.
Yeah, because
His
when you're being told that
birthday.
as a child as well, that's gonna mold how you see the world, right?
Yeah, it is. And that's why I think it's a combination of the two things. We always think
Yeah.
about Richard as a tyrant and a monster. It's like, well, yes, but he's also a product of of his upbringing.
Yeah.
And, he was a child who was told from a very young age that he was divinely appointed as king, that he was, and he believed that. He believed he had no real training for kingship, and he believed that he was unequivocally right about everything. And that really became a problem when he was a teenager, when he started to want to rule more independently, when he started to show signs of having more kingly agency, and his decision making was obscure and tyrannical. And I think a major moment for Richard in his movement from child to adult and having his own sense of kingship was during the Peasants' Revolt, or the
Yes.
end of the Peasants' Revolt. So when Richard finally had that meeting with the rebels at Smithfield, and he it was this moment where it was this is going to be a bloodbath. The nobility around Richard, even the king himself, could end up being destroyed by this rebel army. And Richard had the impeccable nous and actually a very strong sense of self. I mean, I don't think this was necessarily bravery. I think this is just a young man who genuinely thought he was godly, could ride up to this group, this mass of rebels who were all armed and say, I am your king. I will do your willing. We will talk, disband, go back to your homes. He was almost like he was like a Christ-like figure leading his flock. It was a very powerful moment for Richard, and he loved it. And from that moment, he thought, "Hang on a minute, I'm top dog here, and I'm going to do things my way." And
Yeah.
that's exactly how he envisaged the rest of his reign.
Yeah, this wasn't him being brave and saying, I will fight alongside my men and go into battle. This was him so utterly convinced by his own divinity that the rebels would just immediately go along with whatever he said. It's almost it's not bravery, it's just almost his overinflated sense of ego.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. He did have an overinflated sense of ego. I think that he I think that he had an obscure sense of ego as well and an
Mm,
obscure sense of self. I don't think it was, I would certainly put it as something that was a personality disorder by today's standards. I
yeah,
think that that would be a fair enough assessment of Richard. I think that he was incredibly tyrannical in his rage. I think that he could be an incredibly aggressive individual. When we think of Richard, it's not like he was this passive, gentle king who just saw himself as an angel and just sat around wanting people to paint him pretty pictures like the Wilton diptych. He could be incredibly violent
yeah.
and
Well, he's
incredibly
the
aggressive.
inspiration for Joffrey Baratheon, right?
Yeah. Yes, that is quite like how we would imagine Richard. Yeah, he could be incredibly vicious, and I think that he, there's this incident in the death of his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, where at her funeral, the Earl of Arundel shows up late,
Late, yeah.
and then tries to leave early, and Richard beats him with a stick until he's bleeding to the point where the funeral has to be sort of paused because he's got this man bleeding all over the slabs in Westminster. And that's an extreme. It could be extremely violent and extremely volatile. And I think that his volatility became the most concerning and terrifying aspect of Richard towards the end of his reign. I think people didn't know what he was going to do. And for me, moments like that really were demonstrated with the fallout between Thomas Mowbray and Henry, the future Duke of Lancaster, Henry Earl of Derby,
Mm,
and John of Gaunt's son. And you see you see Henry and Mowbray sort of tying themselves in knots, trying to make sure they are on the right side of Richard because he's so unpredictable. And I think that it was his unpredictability that made him so terrifying to people at this point.
hmm.
And you even got figures like John of Gaunt, who was an incredibly powerful man. By the end of his life, he was somebody who was one of the few people that Richard respected, but he was still careful of Richard. He knew that you had to act very cautiously with Richard.
Yeah.
This is somebody who had experienced Richard when he was younger, experienced multiple plots against his life with Richard at the behind them all. He understood that Richard was somebody who blew very hot and cold,
Yeah.
and nobody could really be sure of which way he was going to turn.
Yeah, and something that I wanted to ask you about Richard's story, obviously, is that he is married twice. His second wife significantly younger than him, but he never has any children, which seems crazy considering, this is all about passing on the throne. What was driving that, do you think?
So I think I would agree with Helen Castor on this, and she's obviously written about Richard's psychology in a lot more depth than I was able to do in Sceptred Isle. But I have considered why this was, and I would agree with Helen's analysis that Richard didn't see another king other than himself. Having an heir would almost take take the lens, or take the light away from him. He almost didn't want another
Hmm.
heir. It's like he was such a unique individual and saw himself as such a unique individual. He didn't want to share that space with another person. And it was this all part of this self-obsession and this, I don't think he thought ahead to who would inherit the realm, because I don't think the realm was something that was important to Richard. Richard was important to Richard.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
I think figures like Anne of Bohemia, and, were they even having sex? How regularly were they having? I mean, we know that Anne did seek
If
out
at all.
to have fertility treatment. She looked for aid in conceiving children, which indicates that it's something that was certainly on her mind. It was certainly something that she strove for. So perhaps they were intimate, but Richard, I mean, the truth is in like the fact that he married his second wife, was there was no way he was going to have an heir with Isabella. She was only about six. They were married, six or
Yeah.
seven. She was a child. And I think for Richard in that moment, that was more of an act of diplomacy and bravado and importance, and the amount that came with such a marriage, such a sort of prestigious marriage to a French princess. I think also he perhaps was trying to reflect the marriage of his great grandfather, who we know he revered and respected, and he wanted Edward to be commemorated. I think he had a sense that he was appalled by the fact that Edward was treated in the way that he was. I think that an heir and the future of the dynasty wasn't a concern to him, because he was so obsessed with his own image and his own version of his kingship.
He makes a significant enemy in his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. What was it that led to the cousin's animosity?
So it was Bolingbroke's, would I even call it a mistake? I think Bolingbroke was very like Gaunt in that honor was incredibly important to him, doing the right thing, family, maintaining a sense of regality and status. He was his father he was, built in his father's image in many ways. And I think the mistake that he made, I suppose, in relation to this, was joining with the Lords Appellant. So in the 1380s, there
Hmm.
was a rising against Richard, the later 1380s, with the Lords Appellant, who were a group of lords who, including Richard's uncle, the Earl of Gloucester, Duke of Gloucester, sorry, who stood up to Richard and against some of his favourite individuals, namely Robert de Vere, who is probably as close to a sort of dispenser type figure that you got in Richard's reign. And this culminated in a battle, the Battle at Radcot Bridge, in which Robert de Vere managed to escape. But it was Henry Bolingbroke who joined in that battle, and he led his own sort of faction of the army, and he joined in with his uncle, and he moved against Richard, and he was part of the group of nobles who said enough is enough. We need to see reform in your government. We need to see change after the Battle of Radcot Bridge. And members of Richard's household and his close government were impeached or they were executed as a result of this, and it became known as the Merciless Parliament. And Henry was one of the group of Lords Appellant who did move against Richard in this period, and it was that involvement with these lords that got him into trouble, I think, with Richard later on. But it was Henry and Mowbray, who were the two lords who were sort of on the periphery of these lords appellant. The major three were called the undivided trinity, and that was the Earl of Arundel, the Earl of Warwick, and the Duke of Gloucester, so Richard's uncle. Those three were 10 years later, Richard was sort of biding his time. 10 years later, all three suffered a miserable loss. So the Earl of Arundel was executed. the Duke of Gloucester was taken to Calais and probably murdered. They say he was smothered with a mattress, and the Earl of Warwick was exiled. So it was only left the two, Bolingbroke and Mowbray, left. And at this point, they were back sort of on Richard's side. They were all very friendly, on good terms. But I sort of feel like there was this sort of, he had something up his sleeve. He was waiting for them to mess up in some way in order to punish them for that, for going against him in the first place. And he did, and that obviously manifested in this very famous duel as portrayed by Shakespeare and Richard II, where you have Mowbray and Bolingbroke up against each other. And right at the last minute, Richard says, "Stop, it's not going to go ahead. I'm going to send you both into exile." And this is interesting. It's like, why did he do this? And I think this comes down less to do with Mowbray, but Bolingbroke. He didn't want Bolingbroke to, if Bolingbroke died, he'd become a political martyr. He would be revered in the same way as Thomas Earl of Lancaster had been. That's a real problem for Richard. He hated the way that the Lancasters were important or considered in any way saintly because of the memory of the Earl of Lancaster. So he couldn't have that. And then he knew that if Bolingbroke survived, he would be hailed as a hero. He was already incredibly popular. He couldn't have that either. So I think he realised that the best way to deal with Bolingbroke was just to get him out, get rid of him. Sort of by exiling him, he wouldn't be allowing him any sort of celebrity status. He wouldn't be allowing him he wouldn't be given any sort of it was the most ignoble dull thing to do. It was something that wasn't going to cast any sort of light over Henry.
So Bolingbroke returns from exile in 1399, ostensibly to recapture the Lancastrian lands that Richard snatches. But in the end, Richard is forced into abdicating. So what was ultimately driving this, and how did Richard take the news?
Yeah, not very well. So Richard was, I think it's interesting because his demise was the abdication is very similar to Edward II in that it was more of a forced abdication. It was something that everybody wanted. Richard was ruling with absolute tyranny by this point. Even the people of the realm were completely appalled by Richard as a king. He went around with his own set he basically had a personal bodyguard, which was a group of archers out of Cheshire who all used to wear his personal emblem of a white hart. And he had completely overexerting his control as king. He was reigning with terror, he wasn't fostering any sort of respect. And it ended badly and it ended ignominiously. He was found himself with very few allies. He was eventually caught and brought back to England. He was in Ireland when Henry invaded, and then eventually he was brought over back to England to the Tower of London. And there is this wonderful scene where he is so cross about releasing his crown and giving it to Henry. He takes his crown, and this could be a chronicler's fabrication, but it's still a wonderful moment. He removes his crown from his head and he places it at his feet. He won't hand it to Henry. And I think we don't know a lot about necessarily how Richard was in this period, but there's this wonderful anecdote that his dog didn't recognise him. And I quite like that this isn't the Richard that everyone was used to, of sort of dripping in finery and of this very elevated opinion of himself. He was probably quite a fearful, dejected individual by the end of his reign. But one thing that is certain is in Parliament, when Parliament sort of came together and he was imprisoned, and it was agreed, are we going to depose the king? It was a universal answer was yes, yes, yes. They knew that they had to get rid of him. And I think as soon as Bolingbroke made his mind up to invade England, I think he knew what the outcome had to be. And the only surviving son of Edward III, and it's interesting, we're sort of circling back to the beginning in that, talking about Edward's sons and how unified they were, I think that was the sort of tragedy that Gaunt felt. He felt sorely the tragedy that Richard had completely dismantled this unity, this familial unity that had been so present in the reign of his father. And the only surviving son of Edward III by the time of Bolingbroke's arrival on English shores at Ravenspur was Edmund of Langley, who was Gaunt's younger brother, who was Richard and Bolingbroke's uncle. And it's quite telling, he was ever the diplomat that Langley was. And he said, I'm not going to prevent Bolingbroke invade. I'm not going to prevent you, Henry, but I'm also not going to join you. So he was very careful. He had to sort of step back and let the situation play out. So yeah, I think that his involvement spoke volumes. I think he knew the way it was going to go, but it sort of marks the real tragedy in that sort of family breakdown by Richard's behaviour.
Richard is deposed. Henry Bolingbroke becomes king. He becomes King Henry IV. So my final question for you then is, do you think that Bolingbroke's capture of the throne, did it fundamentally weaken the throne? It's hard to say, but would the Wars of the Roses, for example, been unthinkable were it not for the earlier deposition of Richard?
Yes, I think it did. I think that deposition had obviously taken place before with Edward II, and I think what you saw with the War of the Roses was in some ways repetitive of what happened in the earlier part of the 14th century, with the nature of the politics being very Anglo-centric. Incredibly fractious around the king and the crown. But I think that when became possible for another member to step from outside of that linear kind of inheritant and like a linear Plantagenet line to step in from the outside and take the crown, I think that did pave the way for depositions thereafter, for sure.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on to discuss part 2 of your book. This has been a really fascinating chat. It's just, I loved it because I think, as I said to you in part 1, although I'm identified as a Tudor historian, I'm becoming ever more fascinated by the Plantagenets. So it was really fun to have a chat.
Well, I'm biased. I think the Plantagenets are far more fascinating.
I agree. Well, I'm beginning.
Any way I can convert, I will.
Yes, I'm beginning to feel the same. That I'm marginally more interested in the Plantagenets.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Helen Carr for coming back onto the podcast to discuss all of the dramas of the 14th century with me. Next week, I'm pleased to welcome Karen Davies onto the podcast for a discussion based around a recent article that she published concerning 2 sketches by Hans Holbein, one that has often been claimed to depict Anne Boleyn and another without a confirmed sitter, but has often been labelled as Amalia of Cleves. Karen believes that both of these attributions are fundamentally wrong and has produced considerable evidence to support her theories, greatly dismantling the conclusions put forward by several noted historians. Tune in next Thursday to hear all that she has to say. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.